welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our session. We're talking about engineering resilience with compliance in mind. So I'm Seth Eliot. I'm a principal developer advocate with AWS Developer Relations, and really thrilled to be here with you and joined by two of my colleagues. I'm going to let them introduce themselves now. So Tony.
Hi, I'm Tony Politano. I'm Principal Product Manager for AWS Resilience Hub. I've been with AWS about 5.5 years. I'm excited to come and talk to you about compliance and Resilience Hub today.
And hi, my name is Kevin Quaid, and I have the distinct pleasure of relaying to you that last week I celebrated my 15th anniversary with Amazon, and across that span of time, I've supported roles that have enhanced Amazon's risk posture and resulted in enhanced availability and durability. And with that, I'll pass to Seth.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so to start out, I don't like agenda slides because I just like to tell you the stuff instead of telling you what I'm going to tell you. So instead, I have a roadmap slide. It's very different, trust me, it's not an agenda slide at all. So I'm going to start out talking about resilience and the shared responsibility model. You see here, it talks about customers using best practices, that's you. It talks about AWS having responsibilities, that's shared responsibility for resilience. Then we're going to talk about how that actually helps you with your compliance, especially around resilience-related compliance controls. And Kevin's going to talk to you about those controls and talk to you about compliance. Then the big deal, this is what you got to stay for. Then Tony's going to come up and talk about Resilience Hub. And not only is he going to talk about it, he's going to show how Resilience Hub evaluates those best practices, assesses those best practices for you, and he's going to do a live demo. So live demo on stage showing this, and by assessing those best practices, that will surface any possible compliance risks. So Resilience Hub is going to be your best friend in that way. All right, as promised, I'm going to start off talking about resilience here. So to understand any best practices when you're working with AWS, you have to understand that there's something called the well-architected framework. The well-architected framework is where we put the best practices for operating workloads in the cloud for you folks to use, and it's divided across these 6 pillars here. We're going to concentrate on this pillar, the reliability pillar. And reliability is just saying that your application, your workload in the cloud, does what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it. That's reliability. So resilience is a big part of reliability. In order to be reliable, you have to be resilient. And resilience says that when things happen, when faults happen, when errors happen, your system either works around them or responds quickly to overcome them. All right, so that's what resilience is about. Resilience is about resisting or recovering from failures quickly. So those best practices for resilience, those are all in that reliability pillar. There's the QR code there. If you want to check it out, you could always search for it later. And I like sharing this quote from Werner Vogels. He's the CTO at Amazon. He said, "We needed to build systems that embrace failure as a natural occurrence." And I like this for 2 reasons. The we part. I talked about this shared responsibility model. I'm going to go into more details on that. But there's that we. There's AWS working with you, the customer, to create resilient workloads. That's we. But also, what does it mean to embrace failure? It doesn't mean accepting it. It means being resilient to it, about resisting the failure or working around the failure or recovering from the failure. And when you're talking about failures, they could be small. It could be unplugging a single server. It could be a single hard drive crash, although as far as hard drive crashes go, that is a serious one that is not recoverable, but it's just one hard drive. And in the sense of a data center, it's relatively small. And failures can be big. So a backhoe taking out a fiber line could take out an entire data center. And here we see the North America fiber-seeking backhoe. It is not on the endangered species list. It's actually an invasive species. We're trying to wipe it out. But if that takes out a fiber link, you could take out an entire data center. So failures can be that large. Now, speaking of data centers, all cloud providers, AWS included, have many data centers. And in those data centers are data center things. You don't need me to tell you what's in a data center. Those are the things in a data center, right? And you, as users of AWS, are not using those things directly. You're not using directly our servers or our hard drives. You're using AWS services. And those AWS services represent an abstraction on top of the physical data center. And that's important, right? Because now a lot of those failures, you're protected from them. You're resilient to them almost automatically. So for instance, when that hard drive crashes, remember our hard drive crash there, it's really terrible to look at. Well, if you have data stored in S3, which is object storage, it doesn't matter. That hard drive crashed, took out a replica of your data, but guess what? S3 has at least multiple other replicas of that data. And behind the scenes, without even you knowing about it, AWS knows that hard drive crashed and will replace that and replace your replica. So you never even see that failure. And for the large-scale failures, it's the same deal. This is the global network for AWS showing all the data centers and all the connections between them. 100 gigabit connections, fully redundant, okay? And that full redundancy is important because that means when the fiber-seeking backhoe shows up and takes out a fiber link, there's another one there, and you won't even notice it, or you may not even notice it. That's the resilience of being on a cloud service. So as I said, AWS is running these services on top of their infrastructure. All of that is the AWS side of the shared responsibility model for resilience. So there's AWS with their hardware and services and their global infrastructure, and we are responsible for providing that in a resilient way to you, the customer. But shared responsibility means there's two halves here. The other half is you, the customer. All those boxes you see there around continuous testing, workload, architecture, those are just categories of best practices. And I'm going to talk to you more about specifically what those best practices are that you need to be doing. And Tony's going to show you how Resilience Hub can actually identify whether you're doing those best practices or not. But before we can even talk about those best practices, you really have to understand how AWS lays out its global infrastructure. You probably know there's 31 regions. A region is a cluster of data centers, each one located in a different part of the world, serving AWS services. And you probably also know that each region consists of 3 or more availability zones. What you may not know that each availability zone is a separate data center or data centers from the other availability zones. Availability zones on AWS never share buildings. And they're located far enough apart so they should never share fate. Whether it's an ice storm or a flood or a lightning strike or a power outage, that should not affect more than one availability zone. That's called fault containment. But they're close enough together that we put really low latency network between them, and you could deploy across multiple availability zones and get the fault boundaries, the fault containment, fault tolerance that provides. And it looks like this. So this is just sort of your vanilla 3-tier architecture. And you can see across all tiers, across the load balancers, across the compute, across the database, it's deployed across 3 availability zones. That provides a high availability architecture. So if a fault happens in one availability zone, even a relatively large fault, it's contained there, and the other availability zones continue to operate. Now, these services here, you might notice, are not in availability zones. These are managed services. These are serverless. And in these cases, AWS is taking care of that multi-AZ for you. In other words, like I told you before, S3 replicates your data across multiple hard drives. It also replicates your data across multiple availability zones. DynamoDB is our NoSQL database, similarly does the same thing. Which brings us to an interesting point about shared responsibility. There's our shared responsibility model. There's customer, there's AWS, and for some different services like EC2, which is a server, versus S3, which is object storage, there are some things that AWS is always responsible for. The physical infrastructure, running the cloud service itself. AWS is responsible for that. And there are some things you're always responsible for. Doing backups, configuring them. We give you tools to make it easy. AWS Backup is a great tool, but making sure those backups are done at a certain rate and periodicity that you need, that's up to you. But when you look at EC2, there's a lot of other stuff that's on you, the customer. You have to deploy it across multiple availability zones. EC2s are just servers running operating systems like Linux and Windows. You have to do the security patching. Do we give you tools to do that? Absolutely. But you're responsible for making sure that it's security patched. You're responsible for making sure the OS is up to date. You're responsible for setting up an auto-scaling group so it can scale out. Now, if you look at a serverless service like S3, all of that falls onto AWS. You don't see an operating system when you're storing something in S3. AWS is taking care of all that for you, distributing across multiple availability zones. So you might think, I always want to go serverless, and maybe you do. Some people want more control. Abstraction is great, and that helps protect you, helps take a lot of load off of your plate, but abstraction also takes away control. You want to be able to have more fine control over the operating system, in which case, you know, that's where EC2 and having that pays off. And just closing out this section on resilience, we have a way of thinking about resilience at AWS. We like to divide it into 2 parts because each one has its own different strategies in how you approach building up resilient architectures. versus high availability. I kind of showed you that already on that 3-zone architecture. High availability are those smaller, more frequent, the hard drives getting crashed, the servers getting unplugged things, and they could be fixed usually in place, replacing resources, scaling out, etc. Disaster recovery is the less frequent but more impactful issues, the major disasters, major power outages. And for those, the resilient solution is often to fail over to a new location. So just thinking about it in that way is a helpful mental model. And across all of those, you see continuous improvement. That's because we're always continuously improving. We always have observability. We like to do continuous testing, chaos engineering, injecting faults. So that's always a continuous and iterative process to maintain resilience. And so that covers that section. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Kevin, talk about the compliance side and compliance in the cloud.
All right. Great, thank you, Seth. And again, my name is Kevin Quaid, and my current focus is on delivering security assurance as AWS expands into new infrastructure regions. A number of the 31 regions that Seth talked about, as well as planned regions, some that we're planning to launch as soon as this year include new regions in Israel, Canada, and then into next year, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Thailand. Let's take a quick moment and talk in this context of resilience, how prepared you feel about forthcoming resilience requirements for your industry. So I invite you to take out your phone and scan this QR code. And if you could enter in how prepared you feel, we should be seeing the results in a few moments. And while we're waiting for the results to come in, I want to bring to your attention a lightning talk earlier today. It's not available since it did happen in the past, but a colleague, Malcolm Klein from Salesforce, presented on the shift from on-prem to AWS to improve Salesforce's resiliency posture. It should be available to stream in a couple weeks. We're just waiting for the results to come in. Okay, we do have the results. Let's see. Okay, it looks like we have some good confidence in the group. Others are getting there, and a few unknowns out there as well. Great, thank you so much. We'll go back to the presentation. What we encounter as we look at new regions is a number of hurdles that customers also encounter as they look to deploy workloads in different regions around the world. I'd like to focus on two in particular. First is the rapid evolution of security and compliance requirements. The second one is that we're seeing a need to go deeper and with even more detail around our controls. In a resilience perspective, there's a number of forthcoming regulations that we're keeping an eye on. Things like operational resilience for financial institutions in Europe, DORA. You may have heard of NIS 2. We're seeing a lot of regulations coming out of Europe in this regard. In terms of how AWS documents controls and governance, we think of three broad buckets. The first one is security assurance artifacts. This is things like security assessments, self-assessments. We're continuously learning from our operations and feeding that back into our services and improving how we deliver. Additionally, we undertake a number of certifications and attestations to validate that our controls are effective. Additionally, we're adhering to laws and regulations, things like GDPR and HIPAA. And last, we combine it all under different frameworks. So many of us are familiar with NIST 853. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's other frameworks like the CSA Cloud Controls Matrix, HITRUST, and that just helps us navigate between different certification and attestation schemes. In the context of new regions, I'd like to talk about a new region we launched last year in November, and that's in Hyderabad. That was our second region in India. And in India, in order to provide cloud services to federal public agencies, we need to be impaneled by a ministry called MITRE. And MITRE has a number of requirements, including an audit by an organization called STQC, and a number of underlying audit certifications as well, such as ISO 20000, ISO 27001, and another one is TIA 942. TIA 942, you may be familiar with, is a telecommunication standard for infrastructure, and it covers things like electrical systems, mechanical systems, security. And with the Mumbai region, we were able to leverage TIA 942 certification maintained by our third-party colo facilities. But as we were looking to expand into Hyderabad, we made a decision to build and operate our own data centers. And so we needed to undertake TIA 942 on our own. So it's an example of the shared responsibility model that Seth mentioned, that we were able to undertake this work on behalf of AWS, and then there's benefits falling on to customers. And TIA 942 is just one example of over 140 certifications and attestations that AWS maintains. And underlying all of these certifications and attestations are a number of controls. And these controls span controls for AWS, but also controls that customers can adopt on their own. And again, in the context of new regions, and one area of our responsibility for AWS is to build regions that are compliant and resilient. In fact, Seth referenced a need to ensure that our sites can withstand power outages, that they can withstand different natural catastrophe events. And in fact, there's a SOC control that ties directly to how we incorporate geopolitical risks and environmental risks in our site selection, design, and operation of data centers. We're going to talk a little bit further about a specific control. This is actually a NIST 853 control called CPE-09, and it's related to backup and recovery. And Seth will dive a little bit deeper into that. Just to wrap up on the compliance side, we've talked how AWS helps with compliance with third-party audit reports. We have deep industry expertise. Additionally, we regularly engage with regulatory authorities around the world to understand what their concerns are and to help influence cloud adoption. We regularly support customers with our customer agreements. And last, we provide a number of tools and services to help with security and resilience, including AWS Resilience Hub. I'll pass it back to Seth.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. All right. So now it's starting to come to life, right? So Kevin talked to you about how we're building regions, how we're building in the compliance in the regions. That's all this stuff on the left. The AWS responsibility for CP09, which is about backup and recovery and contingency, is all there, AWS responsibility. Then the customer responsibility is on the right. Okay, these are a list of best practices that you can find in that reliability pillar that I shared the URL with you before, or you could find it later, that you need to be doing. So rather than read these bullet by bullet, I'd like to show it to you graphically. And I'm going to show it to you in the context of what Resilience Hub looks for. So Tony's going to give you the live demo of Resilience Hub in a bit. So Resilience Hub is checking your workloads, your applications for these best practices. It's checking, one, that you've deployed to multiple locations. This is showing that I've deployed a standby to one availability zone. My primary in zone A, I have my standby in zone B, and I've even put a read replica in zone C just for extra resilience. It's checking that I've identified what to back up, and then I'm actually backing it up, and I'm doing that automatically. This is showing a backup in region and showing a copying of that backup cross region. Backing up in region is good. Backing up cross region gives you that extra layer of protection. I think resilience, just like security, is about defense in layers, defense in depth. And it's going to check whether you have it set up for failover to healthy resources. Again, these are all best practices you should be implementing. So if that primary fails, it's going to automatically fail over to that standby, promote that standby. Standby is going to take over the DNS name of the primary. Your clients won't even know anything happened. And the other thing about Resilience Hub is that it doesn't just check these things and say, yeah, you're doing them, yeah, you're not doing them. Even better than that, it tells you, are you meeting your objectives? And when we're talking about objectives, we're going to be talking about disaster recovery objectives of RTO and RPO. RTO is recovery time objective, is the timeline across the bottom there. And a big bad happens in the middle. That's the flames, in case you couldn't tell. The flames are the bad thing. And then the time you're down is your recovery time. So the recovery time objective represents the maximum time you could be down. And you might be thinking, I don't want to be down at all. And we don't want you to be down at all. But different workloads have different requirements. Some can't be down for a few seconds. Some can be down for hours without much business impact. Pick the right recovery objective. You pick the recovery objective that's too strict, you're going to be paying for and implementing and operating recovery mechanisms you don't need. Recovery point objective is about data, but it's also measured on the timeline. You can see that dot, that's a recovery point. That means that's the last time you took a good backup of your data. So between that point and the big flames represents your data loss. There's no data between those points. All right, so you pick an RTO and RPO for Resilience Hub, and you put it in a resiliency policy. And it's going to evaluate your workloads against that resiliency policy. But you don't give it a single RTO and RPO. You actually give it up to 4 pairs of RTOs and RPOs, depending on the type of failure that you're talking about. So first type of failure is an infrastructure failure. This is an EC2 instance having a problem and dying and then being replaced. So what is your recovery objectives for that? Then we talk about availability zone issues. What are your recovery objectives if there's an issue in an availability zone and you need to fail over to the other availability zone and stand up additional capacity there? The third kind, and this is optional, you don't have to put one of these in if you're not multi-region, and most workloads don't need to be, but if you have a multi-region architecture and you need to put in your recovery objectives for a regional issue, if I need to fail over to another region, what are my recovery objectives for that? And this fourth one is a little bit different from the others. This is application failure. This means the accidental deletion or corruption of your data or your code. If that happens, what are your recovery objectives for that? So 4 categories. I think Tony's going to deep dive on the application one with you and show you how that.
Resilient. Sorry. We're going to start with a polling question. So take a picture and we're go through the poll. While we're doing this, talk a little bit about the history of Resilience Hub. So Resilience Hub, I'm going to show you, has been out since November of 2021. It's meant to look at resiliency of an application as a whole. What we've really been focusing on a lot is how can it help you with understanding compliance issues that are related to resiliency. Like Kevin talked about earlier, there's a whole resilient perspective that there is out here for different frameworks and controls that are out here. So what we're looking at doing is how do we use Resilience Hub towards understanding that more and more.
It blinks, so you're good.
I'm good?
You're good.
Let's press the button.
No, you tell him.
Now we're up. I didn't see it come up. Okay, so, wow, pretty well spread out. So central management, normally see that, in the larger organizations that are out here. You're measured, centrally, but not managed, but not centrally managed. So this is kind of the diversity that's out here. This is a common pattern that we see that's wrapped around here. Appreciate the feedback on this. So let's talk about Resilience Hub. There's really 3 major capabilities that we're going to go over, and then I'll demonstrate to you and tie them back to what we just talked about for these various CP9s and the different controls that we have out here. The first thing, you're going to see us run an assessment. What an assessment does is look at an application that's out there. An application can be a business application like SAP. It could be a set of resources such as a bunch of storage, a storage pool. It could be what you define as that application. I want you to keep in mind as we're going through Resilience Hub, application is what you call it. We're not saying it has to be a single microservice or 500 EC2s. It's up to you on what it is. And you can run this and schedule this on a daily basis. So the concept of protecting you from drift coming out of compliance. The second is for things that we will find, we're not just going to say, oops, you're not good. We're going to give you various ways that you can make improvements and get yourself back into compliance for this. And we're going to give a couple different options. One is, one is very much of as much as you can do, so optimize. Another is one which is minimal cost. How can you get there with just the bare minimum for doing this? Another most interesting one, I think, is minimal changes. How can you do something with the smallest amount of change to your infrastructure as code or your architecture for doing this? The other thing that we're going to do, though, is not just say how to get yourself into a resilience posture from a configuration, but how to make sure that your operations are in place for monitoring this. So we're going to give recommendations for CloudWatch alarms specific to your type of stack that you have in there. We're going to give you standard operating procedures, which are SSM automation documents. For example, if we see RDS in there, we'll give you the automation document for recovering and restoring that. And the last thing is we'll give you fault injection experiments. This is our chaos testing tool with the ability for going in and running tests to confirm that what we just told you in Resilience Hub we can really do. I'm not going to go through most of this except for to say we onboard stuff with Resilience Hub. We can point at CloudFormation, we can point at Terraform, we can point directly at Kubernetes, we can point at resources that are grouped together that are tagged through resource groups. Like Seth said, we're going to set some policies. We're going to definitely run the assessment, and we're going to look at what's out there, and then we want you to implement these recommendations. So I'm going to kind of do all this. I'm going to really compress down what would be a really big life cycle and fix some stuff. We're going to find some problems. We're going to do this. I'm not necessarily going to run the fault injection simulator and other pieces out there, but that's what we're going to do. What this slide is about is getting to the bottom right. It's reducing application outages, because outages are what are what we need to control, what are wrapped around the RTOs and the RPOs that are here. And the best way to do that is through continuously validating this. And looking at consistent targets that you have for your RPO and RTO. It really doesn't make sense if you have an organization where tier 1 has an RTO of 15 minutes and somebody else's tier 1 has an RTO of 17 hours. Some consistency that you can do, and the concept of a resilience policy allows you to do that. And then identify issues early on. This session is really about shifting left and getting earlier on in the life cycle your understanding of compliance problems that are going to come up when you eventually go towards attestation on this. Laundry list of what we cover. I'm not going to go through all of these. You see most of the major players in the compute, networking, database storage, and queue space in here. And what we're really going to do today is focus on using those in a hands-on perspective now. One last question for you all. So take one last one here, and then we'll get into the demo. The demo, what I'm going to do in here, you're going to see as we go forward in here, I'm going to show you what you would normally do in a much more controlled environment. Running an assessment. We're going to make some live changes to my application, which I'm sure most of you are not allowed to do in your console. So we're going to kind of cheat it here a little bit for squeezing this in. But we wanted to give you kind of the full life cycle view that if you went in and you actually made these changes using your standard procedures like running your pipelines or updating your infrastructure as code or other pieces that there are associated with that we would be able to show you what the end game would look like in here. So we're good? We're good, we can see the results. Again, so how are you gathering your data? Well, the good news is we don't gather any data yet. If I would have saw that there, I'm going to ask you, who is that person out there? But design architecture standards during development. It's really nice to see that you're doing this, because this is ultimately where a lot of people break down. They're not looking back in development on where they're going this and trying to catch these things much later on. Great.
I'm gonna switch back.
You can switch back. Okay, so let's rewind to what Kevin talked about, and then Seth emphasized more. CP9 is a control and NIST. It wants to make sure that your storage, your ephemeral storage, whether it's in database or whether it's in object or in file storage, you have a plan for backing it up and you're configured properly for backing it up. We're going to laser focus in on those right now. So we're going to look at storage and we're going to look at database, and we're going to use Resilience Hub to tell us if we're at risk. Going to follow 6 easy steps here, and they are quick steps. So we're going to onboard an application to Resilience Hub. I'm going to bring this in live, bring in, and we're going to point it at an application that is grouped together by tags. We're going to confirm that what we're looking for is storage and that it's in there. I've purposely made this application just storage. Most likely you're going to have compute and other things in there, which I'll show you where you could just point at just the storage if you wanted for this. We're going to pick a resiliency target. These are these policies that we have. And then we're going to run the assessment. The assessment is going to come back. And yes, it is going to find some problems because it'd be really, really boring if I ran this and it just said everything's good, we can all leave, but maybe you could all get to happy hour or your flight's a little faster if we did that. And then I'm going to fix a couple things in here. So again, you would probably not do this live. You probably wouldn't go to the console and start mucking around with storage and databases, but we're going to do that. And then I'll rerun the assessment to get this done. So I'm going to flip right over here. Actually, Seth is going to flip me right over here. I'm in Resilience Hub. Resilience Hub is, first let me first show you what this looks like. I created a project in here called Compliance Project. And for those of you that aren't familiar with resource groups, what resource groups does is allow you to take resources that are tagged the same. So I had something where I had a tag called project, and that project was called Compliance Project. And it ended up having in here some EFS, some Dynamo, some S3, and some more Dynamo that's in here. So this is kind of my topology. I've purposely kept my compute out just to make this a bit shorter. You probably have your compute in here already. So if I go to Resilience Hub, I'm not going to take my survey on how Resilience Hub is doing. I'm going to add an application. When I add an application, I'm going to name the app here. And I'm going to grab my resource group that I just showed you there. So I go to my resource group. Resilience Hub is going to present to me all the resource groups that there are there. I'm going to grab that one for that compliance project. By the way, if you're multi-account, multi-region, we can go across multiple accounts in multiple regions. I know most people use federated accounts and others. I'm kind of within a single account for this right now. Remember I talked about being able to schedule this and look at this. I'm going to kind of turn this off because we're just going to run this once, but this would run this once a day for you so that you can see if there's problems. I'll click on next here and it's going to come back and it's going to read that resource group that I showed you earlier. So when it comes back after reading that resource group, it's going to say, hey, here's what Resilience Hub found. Do you want me to look at all these? If I saw stuff in here because I'm looking at CP9 and really just wants to look at storage and I saw compute in here, I could leave it in. It's not going to hurt anything, but I would make my results a little longer at the end so I can go in here and I could exclude these out if I wanted to, if pieces were in here. I'm going to move forward with this. And then I'm going to look at a resilience policy that there is out here. So I've already created a resilience policy, and what it's doing, it's looking for unrecoverable. I'm not as concerned about RTO and RPO right now because CP9 just wants to know that there's something in place for you to do this. It's not about being able to understand RTO, RPO. There are other use cases absolutely for that, but we've run out of time in the demo for doing that. So we're going to just concentrate on here and have a policy that's set up for this. And then I'm going to get the obligatory, hey, this is what you're about to do, AWS screen. And I'm going to publish this application. And it's going to drop me into my workflow. In my workflow, I'm going to assess this. And what the assessment is doing right now is I've pointed through resource groups at a set of resources that make up a project. Resilience Hub is reading the metadata of those resources to see how it's configured. It is not touching the actual user data in there. In fact, we will tell you, like when I look at compute and stuff, I will tell you, I don't know if Minecraft or SAP is running on there. All we know is the configuration of what this is. We don't know if this bucket contains the most sensitive data or contains family photos. It's not important for us to understand that. What we're looking at is how you've configured it. What are your HA and DR capabilities that you've enabled for these buckets, for these tables, for these file systems that are out there to tell you what type of risk you do have for this. So if I come back here, I will get back a result, an assessment report. So an assessment report, like Seth talked about earlier, it analyzes for application, infrastructure, availability zone, and if this was a multi-region application, those regions wouldn't be blanked out here. But what it's looking at, again, availability zone is looking if, what is your risk if the availability zone went out? We're getting some RTOs in this. We know that we're sitting at a near zero for that. Infrastructure is a distinct hardware failure. That is that hard drive or server going kaput out there. and the application which is in the unrecoverable state for us. This means we have a problem. In other words, Resilience Hub has looked at this and examined all possible ways that you could possibly recover this, and we can't find a path to recovery if you've had a problem on the application. Now, Seth mentioned earlier, what does that mean? It means maybe you overwrote this file, or maybe the corruption got into it. So you're in a situation where we can't find a way for you to be able to recover that. So let's dive a little deeper into what those problems are. If I just click on here, I get my nice little grid view here, and you'll see that I have two things which are unrecoverable in here. The first is this Dynamo database, and the second is this S3 bucket. So I have storage. If I were to go to attestation today, I would be at risk of not being able to provide proper attestation for NIST, SC9, and by the way, there's an SC9 in all the other frameworks. So whether it's PCI DSS or HIPAA or DORA or others, they all have their evil twins over in the other frameworks that this would apply to. So you would use this for your particular framework. I'm at risk of being able to comply right now. So I can get a quick little look at this one here for this Dynamo. And what this is telling me here, as you can see from the quick pop-up, is that it doesn't have a backup. You haven't backed this up. You haven't put point-in-time recovery out here. It's something you need to fix for this. If you fix this, you will most likely be in good shape for this. So why don't we do some live work here? Again, you probably wouldn't do this for real, but I'll look at the Dynamo table, and I'll open up this Dynamo table here. And within here, I know, just because I've done this enough times, that my backup or my point-in-time recovery is not enabled here. I'll turn on my point-in-time recovery, which means I now have backups in place for this. And I will go back over to Resilience Hub. I will now take and look at the second one here, which is S3. And S3 is a problem in that versioning is not enabled, or we don't have something in place for a backup plan for this. This is, again, S3 is going to be fine, S3 is going to be up, but you've polluted, you stepped on that object in there, and you will not be compliant by having a proper backup configuration in place for this. So I will go in and I'll take a look at this one here and look at that S3 bucket. Again, you probably would not do this live. I know I'm going to say that over and over again, but I don't want you going home and going to your production systems and mucking around in the console for this. I know if this is under properties here, I'm going to turn on versioning for this. It's kind of an easy way to do this. I'm going to save the changes to this. And then I'm going to come back here to Resilience Hub. I'm going to say, okay, I think I fixed everything. Can we go back and reassess this? So I'm going to run the assessment again. Remember, the assessment is going and look at the configuration. I've made configuration changes in here. So my configuration changes should have an impact on showing if I'm recoverable or unrecoverable in this situation. Take the risk out of here. Now imagine applying this to hundreds or thousands of storage resources, storage and database resources that you have out here. This is something where you'll be able to home in directly on where those risks are and take advantage of them very early on in the life cycle. It's not something like you need to wait until it's further down and ready to go to production. So if I go in here, I will now go and look, and I'll see that all those nice red marks are gone that are in here. I want to point out here that although we've brought this from recoverable to unrecoverable, there's some really cool data up here right now that we're pointing out the estimated RTO and the estimated RPO here. So there are other compliance controls or even business controls you want to have that aren't related to compliance. We're going to get great insight into here. We're kind of using Resilience Hub, which does a lot of stuff to focus in on some of these pieces here around CP9 and other controls that we have out here. But it's really, this is something that can help you with understanding where we are in each one of these. So if I wanted to, I could go in and look at my operational recommendations now on what would need to be done for this. So I've brought this compliant. What's Resilience Hub going to tell me to do? Resilience Hub is going to tell me three different things. It's going to tell me alarms that I should enable for this. So
Ignore me.
Ignore you? Okay. Is going to tell me alarms that I should look at for this. And for these alarms, it's specific to the tables, files, and databases that we've seen. That's why you see quite a bit of repetition in here. You can see alarm reports when throttling exceeds, and you see it over and over again in here for these dynamos and for these 34, 35 errors that there are out here. You could take these, and if you clicked on these, you would create a CloudFormation template and be able to enable this, thus getting ahead of the game that I brought this thing compliant, and I've got some operational procedures in here for this. The operational procedures in this case being alarms. The second part of your operational procedures, though, would be standard operating procedures or SSM automation documents. So in the case of this here, we talked about, we had the S3 here. So we enabled the S3. What would I have to, where are the procedures in the automated procedure that I would have to have in order to bring this back if I needed to? So these are automation documents that you can then take and deploy, make part of a run book or a run book of run books that you would have, which would be tied into this. So again, we've kind of looked at where you are, and we've brought you some alarms for alerting, and we've brought you some SOPs for this. The last, and follow the same procedure for this, by the way. I could click on these here and go generate the CloudFormation template, and it will implement these on my behalf with the right security and roles, obviously. Fault injection. I don't have a polling question. Anybody here familiar with fault injection? Okay, fault injection simulator is our chaos testing capability that we have at AWS. It has the ability for running chaotic tests or causing damage in your system, literally. So it tries to break things. Please don't go and run this against production the first time. But these are tests that will confirm some of the things that we just worked out in the previous steps. So in the previous steps, we configured things, we made them better, we set up alarms, and we had SOPs. Well, now we're going to put all that into motion through fault injection tests. So fault injection will cause a fault, which will trigger an alarm, and you should be rehearsing through those SOPs to bring that back. So we've started with this little problem of, I want to make sure my storage is compliant. I found that I could have some problems with that, and we've kind of extended this down into the operational end. The recommendations that you get in here are dependent on your workload. If you had a workload that didn't have certain types of resources, or you had duplicate resources that are in here, we're going to give you the different capabilities for doing that. So let's go back up to here to the application, and last thing I want to do here is quickly make a change to the resilience policy. So what I'm going to do in this resilience policy now is open up this policy and edit it. And if you notice, this one, like we talked about earlier, didn't have a regional, because I was assuming this is a single region application. What if I have a really complex application and I want to put in my RTO into here? You're probably asking me, why am I putting days in here for this? Who the heck has RPOs of days for critical applications? The reason is because I really don't care about RPO and RTO numbers for this application, because I'm interrogating recoverable, unrecoverable. You would probably use a real RTO and RPO in here if you weren't in this space. So I've updated that policy. I'll go back to that application. And in that application, I will now assess it using that new RPO and RTO. Now, if I have multiple RTO policies, I could change them and try to do kind of what ifs. What if this is a single region? What if this is a multi-region? That's kind of what I'm doing right now, seeing what the exposure is for a single and multi-region configuration. You're going to see that it comes out different now. So now I'm back in an unrecoverable state. So this application was compliant if it was a single region. Now I'm unrecoverable in multi-state. This is really important to understand the topology of where you're trying to execute. Now I'm not going to go through and try to fix all these, But just to show you, all that stuff that was really good in a single region is going to require a lot more attention out here for doing this. So if I looked at this, I would see that I don't have cross-region backups. The recommendations are quite different in here for doing this. In fact, if we want to get more detail about these recommendations, instead of just that little flyover that we have here, I will see multiple options in here. So this option is for my Dynamo table. And I'm getting really two options. Option one is both the cheap one and minimal change one, so it's kind of the easier one, and then the more expensive one over on the side here. The difference between these two here is higher level of protection. They will both get you into that RTO, RPO zone, but they are definitely different ways of looking at it. If I were to go up here and go down and look at the storage, you can see similar type of things for storage. You know, the one storage says modify the in-region backup plan. So I'm going to modify the in-region backup plan to have a cross-region backup plan. The other is to do this cross-region data replication for the EFS, and then enable recovery of the file system in an alternate. Different ways that you can look at solving this. As you can see, it seemed really simple in the beginning when it was single region. It's really complex on the options that you need here, and this is where Resilience Hub is supposed to take that complication out there and guide you to how to get yourself, in this case, into that recoverable state, and others to get you into that RTO state that there is. So, you know, in summing up about Resilience Hub, we really brought an application on board. We set a resilience policy. We knew we were going after recoverable, unrecoverable for storage, so we made sure that only storage and databases were in there, which we had some storage and some databases. We found a couple culprits in there that were risky for us. We got advice from Resilience Hub on how to fix this, being that it's a single region application. Why don't we fix those? We ran the assessment, and that assessment, that was all real time. It's not like I staged two assessments here. I know when I see demos sometimes, I'm trying to figure out which one is pre-staged and which one isn't. We went live against this and did this. And then we went and we moved the goalpost. And we said, okay, this is a much more complex application. It's no longer single region, it's multi-region. You see the complexity of what you need to do ends up going up much more for this. So that's kind of the workflow on where we went.
Yeah.
So what does the Resilience Hub do? It's not an attestation tool. We have great stuff for that. We have audit, we have Audit Manager, we have Config, we have Security Hub. These are great tools for getting to the attestation. What we're doing is what we call shift left. We're shifting very early on into the development cycle. What if you ran Resilience Hub in your first sprint as you people were starting to set up your storage and other pieces out there? It's a lot easier, a lot cheaper to fix things early on in the life cycle, and that's what Resilience Hub is about. Resilience Hub is not about an afterthought. Although you can apply it to an application which is already out there, which we definitely want you to do that also. But we want you to use it early on and engineer in resilience for doing this. Now, we homed in on this one control, and it's like, oh my gosh, all this rigmarole for one control out here for doing this. We picked an example control for you. And these are some other compliance controls. You can be creative in this, in what we're doing. For example, you know, there's an auto scaling capability that's out there. Resilience Hub looks and makes sure that there's auto scaling in place and that auto scaling is configured properly. So you're going to get out ahead. And these are only NIST controls. Remember, there's evil twins for each one of these in the other frameworks that there are out there. We could look for system partitioning. So this goes back to what we just did, multi-AZ, multi-region. So we want to make sure that your application can survive in a multi-region or in a multi-AZ type of capability that there is out here. Contingency plan testing. Remember I said at the end that we go into FIS in order to do our testing? Well, this is exactly what we should be doing. We should have a plan in place for contingency testing, and this can help us to understand, are we leveraging the tools that AWS has, like Fault Injection Simulator, for doing this? These are recommendations that we're doing. Again, you know, you're going to want to run your full attestation as you do this, but things early on that we can really help you out with. The other thing, we showed you those SOPs. So again, understanding from CP10, SC24, SOPs are needed. We're going to kind of give you a little bit of that helping head start in what we're doing wrapped around with this. So I want to wrap up with a little bit of summary on us here. You know, we started out that we're a shared responsibility model. You know, we went through a lot about what we do from our end. We do a lot from our end to make sure that from our end of shared responsibility, from the regions, from the availability zones, from the data centers, the hardware that's in there, all the controls and checks that we do on that end. We're taking care of our end of the shared responsibility model that's on here, but there's your end of the shared responsibility model. And if you look at the things that we uncovered in here, they're all customer and shared responsibility issues that we had in here. The things where the tools are available. You know, in this case, the backup tools and the recovery tools are definitely there and definitely available. In the case of this application, they weren't configured for it. So they were there, they weren't available. So the idea is to help you with your end of the shared responsibility model and what you can end up doing this. We gave one example of going down to a framework and control. We have a list of other ones that this helps with. You can be creative. Now you do this. We're really using Resilience Hub. I don't want to call it an off-label usage of it, but it's a way of using Resilience Hub to tie it in with ways to get you to shift left and get ahead of where there are possible risks that there are in this. So we're going to surface these ideas and allow you to go and fix them to make your eventual compliance a lot easier as you move along, and we're going to help to concentrate where those efforts should be. So we're not just going to say, it's broken. We're going to show you how to go fix it. We're going to, in this case, we went after recoverable and unrecoverable in what we're doing here. In other cases, you would use RTO and RPO. So use the resilience policies to your advantage. Use them using with regions, without regions. Some are numerical, like I showed you, this one is 1 day, because I really didn't care much about how long it took. I just wanted to make sure and get that checkbox that I'm in a recoverable state for doing this. And we can help protect you against drifting. So there's 2 ways to help protect you against drifting and resurface the risk. The first way is all those operational recommendations that we made. Make sure that you have your proper monitoring and alerting out there for this. You know, we find many customers that they will get themselves resilient, but they won't have the proper alerting out there for understanding when they're drifting away from resilience. What I mean by that is, in the case of EC2, people will turn on EC2 state failed instance or instance in a failed state, but they won't turn on things like there's a memory run or a CPU run or a memory leak that's in there, which are most likely early indicators that there could be a problem. So we're kind of helping out a little bit with getting ahead of the game in that from an operational perspective. For the SOPs, understanding built-in SOPs that you can use and modify as you need instead of starting from scratch in here, and then helping you out to understand where are the tests that you can do with this, and how do you put the bow on it with the test? Because remember, tests trigger alarms because they inject a fault, which makes you to want to do an SOP or a recovery procedure to be able to do that. And then the test ends, and then your alarm state is out, and then you go back and you loop this through Resilience Hub. The second way we protect you from drift is like I showed you with the scheduled assessments. So let's say I do get this going okay, and let's say I'm in sprint 2. I turn this on, and I'm making sure that I'm engineering in from the beginning, compliance related around this. Do you hear that? Okay. If you run the scheduled assessment, you will see each day if something's drifted out in where you're going. Last thing here, some resources. First, responsibility matrix for alignment. Second, Seth is talking about the reliability pillar and third one is we do a lot of these hands-on days with this. Check for resilience days. I've done a bunch of these. They're a way for you to get in there and understand what this really does, which, by the way, you can try this. You can try this at home yourself, not to get into economics, but Resilience Hub is 6 months, free tier, up to 3 applications. And even after that, it's only $15 a month per application. So the idea that we have behind Resilience Hub is to make it affordable and approachable for you. There are some toolkits and some open source out there, but I want to thank all of you with our folks here for coming on in.
Thank you.
Now you go. Thank you.